that most people thought would be the 6th or 7th overall pick. And, well, that worked out pretty well for the Astros. So you never really know, but the consensus among all the pundits is that Adley Rutschman is not only the top player in this draft, but some people have gone as far to say he's the best prospect we've seen at the top of the draft since Bryce Harper, which you're talking 9 years ago at this point. But that's not to say that Bobby Witt Jr. isn't considered a very strong prospect who would be the number 1 overall pick most years. And that's not to say there aren't some other players at the top of the draft that, who knows, maybe the Orioles or other teams at the top do like a little bit more than the so-called talent evaluator experts out there. But I think if we're all looking at this thing, for anyone who's consumed as much draft coverage as you can, understanding that college baseball and high school baseball is not followed nearly as closely as football, for example, but I think the overwhelming consensus is that Rutschman's the best player in this draft. But is it Bobby Witt Jr., or do the Orioles try to go under slot and try to sign a few more high school players then with the money that they save in their bonus pool and go after someone like Andrew Vaughn or draft a J.J. Bleday from Vanderbilt, something like that, where would clearly be taking a player that is considered a little bit inferior to Rutschman or Witt. But
by the way, you better not be talking about that tomorrow. We better not be talking about taking inferior players, because that'll tell me the old man is sitting up and eating more than
No, Nestor. That's not what we're talking about here. The top 10 rounds of the draft, you have to listen.
Go ahead.
The top 10 rounds of the draft, each team is allotted a pool of bonus money that you can spend in the same way that we've talked about the international scouting.
I'm glad you understand it a lot more than me, because
of this
for years, just so you know, for years, one of the reasons this team stunk was because Angelos bucked the system, told the Flanagans, told the Sid Thrifts, we're not signing any Bryce Harpers. We're not signing any we don't want the best players. That went on for a generation in baseball, and, I just hope whatever they're doing, there is no financial consideration in any of it other than getting the best baseball players. And that goes to getting players in Venezuela, in Puerto Rico, in the Dominican, in Asia, wherever it is. They've just made so many excuses for 25 years, Luke. You know what I mean? So I am reactive to anything that says, well, we're going to go below. The words below slot are a vernacular to any baseball fan that says, yeah, my owner's trying to screw agents and screw players, not trying to get the best players. And while this team's going to lose 100 games again this year and next year, they better be getting the best players. They better have really fixed things, because we're watching.
Well, and again, when I say going below slot, that's not in the name of saving money to put in your pocket. It's to then go out and draft a player in round 2, round 3, round 6, let's say,
that doesn't
round
cost
9,
all of your pool
and those
money.
four
Understood.
Players, and some of those guys who seem committed to going to college, all of a sudden you give them an extra $750,000 or an extra $1 million, 1.5, whatever it is, and all of a sudden, okay, maybe you didn't take the absolute best player in the draft, but if you net 3 other players that you think are whatever you think their overall talent level is, but they're worthy of a bigger bonus, that you can get them into your organization, then there's a very fair argument to that. I mean, you look at the absolute best drafts, and I even wrote about this at WNST.net, not that it was a strategic underslot kind of approach, but 2 of the best drafts you can look at in the history of this organization. 1973, the Orioles drafted Eddie Murray and Mike Flanagan. Their first-round pick that year was Mike Parrott. He appeared in 3 games for the Orioles.
I remember that name, by the way. You remember every first round. It's like remembering Brashad Perryman or Sergio Kindle, who never put a jersey on, right?
Right, but my point is, it's not so much that the first round or the number 1 overall pick isn't important. It is important, and I think it's as symbolic as it is critical for this organization, for its fan base, for anyone who's following this team and seeing it lose well over 100 games now, on track for the 2nd straight year. But I think we also have to remember that the number 1 overall pick isn't the end-all, be-all. And the perfect example to remind you of that is, look at what this team's record was with Manny Machado last year before they traded him. So I'd much rather see the Orioles. And by the way, I'm not saying they should go under slot and try to get cute with money and try to push money around and see if you can add 3 more players, sign 3 more players that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to sign, because I think there is a danger of getting too cute there, not in the name of saving money, but just trying to be too smart, and then it doesn't work out quite as well as you'd like it to. You know, I'd like to see this team take who they believe is the absolute best player in the draft, whether it is Rutschman or whether you do like Bobby Witt Jr., the high school shortstop, a little bit more because of position longevity, because of the fact that he's a high school player, and you're talking about a team that's very unlikely to be competitive in 2 or 3 years when Adley Rutschman absolutely will be ready for the major leagues, at least what people expect. So I'll hear that argument, but yeah, I think there's a danger of trying to get too cute, more so than just trying to be cynical about them saving money. But I think it's very important to realize that there are many paths to a successful draft, and if it's all said and done, I'd much rather see the Orioles come away with a collection of legitimate prospects over the next 3 days rather than putting all eggs in the basket into the number 1 overall pick and hoping that's a generational talent, which, even if it's a good number 1 overall pick, doesn't mean it's going to be a Hall of Famer. I mean, that just look at the history of this draft, for that scenario, and then you don't come away with anything.
Well, you can name the last 20 number 1 guys in the draft, right? Upton. You go through all these names. Not a lot of Hall of Famers. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Not a lot of Peyton Mannings. A whole lot more, Quentin Coriats or whatever, right? I mean, make up a name you want.
I mean, you want to find a player who can be a cornerstone for the organization. And if it's Rutschman, so many people are going to draw comparisons to Matt Wieters. And
there's an argument not to take a catcher. I mean, Alan McCallum's been out online making that argument for the last 5 days. I don't have a strong opinion one way or another on the backside of this that isn't Baseball America's opinion, because you put 10 times the amount of time into it that I do, and they take 1,000 times. It's what they do. So it's kind of like NFL draft when you're watching Kuiper, or you're watching Dan Jeremiah, or before that Mayock, or even back to Joel Bushbaum. Give him a little bit of love as well. But you say tomorrow morning they better have something that sounds sensible to the industry. And that didn't go on for a long time around here, right? I mean, Mike Flanagan, before he died, told me all of the war stories of phone calls to him and we're not taking this guy. You would go into the draft and the owner would tell you, here are the 8 guys you're not allowed to take, and they're the 8 best players.
Yeah. Well, and again, though, you have to keep in mind the draft system has changed quite a bit.
I understand that, but if you wonder why the Orioles are a disgrace,
that's right. I followed it too. I get it. I'm not disagreeing with you, but I don't know how relevant that is to comparing 15 years ago to now because of the system in and of itself. Now,
I don't think John is saying to anybody in the baseball department, that's too much money for me. I think those days are over on that side. I mean, for the draft anyway. I'm not accusing John in lieu of that. I think, by the way, shame on Elias and Meidel if they took this gig. And John Angelos is on the bat phone there saying, I don't want a catcher. You know what I mean? Like, if that's happening tonight, they shouldn't be running the team tomorrow, literally.
It comes down to the fact that, and this really lends itself to what you just said a couple moments ago about, you need to trust this guy. I mean, Mike Elias was scouting and in charge of the Astros drafts the last several years. I mean, that's what he did. Now, not every pick was perfect. I mean, you can point to a Mark Appel, you can point to a Brady Aiken, and see that it doesn't always work out.
And Astro Ball took a real stab at that, right? Like, literally, Ozzie won 2 Super Bowls, but we still see her and talk about Mark Clayton and Brashad Perry. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
That's the way it goes, right?
Yeah, so that's why it's also important to not put too much stock, too much emphasis into whoever they take 1-1. It's important, don't get me wrong. I mean, you have a chance to, whoever that potential Hall of Fame player is in this draft, whether they're drafted first overall, whether they go 20-something like Mike Trout did, whether it's someone that goes in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or even 13th round, let's say, there's a decent, reasonable chance there's a Hall of Famer in this draft. And when you're picking first overall, you have the first shot at getting that player. Now, the odds tell us it probably won't be the Orioles who draft that Hall of Fame player. Or who knows? Maybe it will be but it might be the Orioles taking that player in the third round who suddenly pops and was someone that the scouts and all, who just slipped through the cracks. So, but it is important, but this needs to be something that's just viewed as part of the big picture. And like I said, a truly good draft for the Orioles won't just be nailing the first overall pick. It's going to be bringing in a number of guys that serve as legitimate prospects, and a couple others end up becoming major leaguers, hopefully good major leaguers, and you have some other prospects who develop to the point where 3, 4, 5 years down the road, you can even use those players to trade for other assets that you need, hopefully at a point when you're getting much closer to contention where you're trying to augment your roster, fill in gaps, trading from a position of strength to acquire a position of need. The draft is, we talk about this all the time in the NFL, and I think there's much more second guessing with the NFL because the draft itself is so much more mainstream. College football itself is so much more mainstream than college baseball, which, ESPN was showing it over the weekend and actually had a chance to see a little bit of Adley Rutschman even, but not something that you're watching on a regular basis.
Yeah, you're watching clips on YouTube, man.
Exactly, exactly. So that's where I think it is important to trust Elias, to trust the scouting department, and even talking about the Orioles themselves, the last couple years, their drafts individually have actually been viewed more favorably than previous years. Now, there are questions about player development, but we've talked about it in passing, but Grayson Rodriguez, their first pick last year, who wasn't ranked as highly as the Orioles ended up taking him, he's been unbelievable so far this year. So maybe the Orioles last year, even with how much losing was going on at the major league level, well, the scouts saw something in Grayson Rodriguez, and now this new regime and new player development system is taking a guy that was pretty talented, and he looks really, really good very early in his professional career. So, again, there's a long way to go. This first overall pick is just the next step, but I do think it's fair to note that this is going to be the beginning of the real judgment of Mike Elias. For these last 6 months, we knew that they were going to beef up analytics. We knew they were going to beef up technology. Brandon Hyde seemed like a perfectly reasonable hire. Do we really know he's a really good manager yet or not? No, we have no idea because Casey Stengel, reincarnate, would not win with this 2019 Orioles.
Yeah, Bruce Bochy came in here. They gave him some drinks the other night. He didn't win it, literally.
Yeah, Earl Weaver wouldn't win with this team. So, and that's not a knock on Brandon Hyde, and that's not a compliment to Brandon Hyde. It just means that the field manager, and I said this to you back in December, I wasn't trying to be cavalier about it. It just wasn't that terribly of a critical hire at this present stage where they're losing a whole lot. As long as you don't hire someone who's completely incompetent, as long as you hire someone who is going to understand player development and be on board with the organizational philosophies, then fine. But my point is, this first overall pick and this draft is the real beginning of judging Mike Elias and really looking at how this thing is going and how it's on track. I mean, analytics and technology and the international market efforts that we'll begin to see next month when the new signing period begins, those were prerequisites to Elias getting the job. That was clearly something that John and Lou Angelos valued on paper as far as bringing in someone who was well-versed with drafting and scouting in the international market. So it's not a surprise that the Orioles have done those things. Now, we'll see what fruits they're able to reap eventually because it's not something that you're going to see results overnight. But this is the first real big decision that Elias is going to make that, like I said, even if it's as much symbolic as it's really, really important, this is where we're going to begin to judge him. And if they take Adley Rutschman and he ends up being a bust and Bobby Witt ends up becoming the next Alex Rodriguez, then that's going to look really bad. And vice versa, if they take Witt and he struggles to develop and Rutschman's the next Johnny Bench, then we'll look at that and question and start to doubt. But the point is, you need to get this right, and you want to get the first overall pick right. You want to get the rest of this draft right, and even if it ends up not going according to plan perfectly, you want to come away with not just the top overall pick being a good player, but you want to come away with multiple prospects. And what you hope in a good major league draft, that's when you come away with 2 or 3 legitimate major league players from varying degrees to solid to great. If you can come away with 3 future major league players in this draft, and some other prospects that you trade along the way, then that's a really successful draft. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Important to understand that there are a lot of ways to get to a successful draft, but of course, when you're picking first overall, you're going to dream about drafting that Hall of Famer. When the Orioles drafted Matt Wieters 12 years ago, everyone hoped he would be Johnny Bench. Everyone said he was going to be Joe Mauer with power. And okay, it didn't work out to that degree, but they still drafted a guy who made it to multiple All-Star games, won Gold Gloves, and was part of some pretty good clubs, some of the best clubs of the last 35 years of this organization. So I think it's important to remember that just because everyone thinks Adley Rutschman is going to be an absolute stud, it might just turn out that he's a good player. But if you couple that with finding some other good players in this draft, then you start to make progress and you start to reach and see a little more light at the end of the tunnel for, let's face it, a lot of losing, very cold, not very much fun last year or this year, as it looks again like the Orioles are on track to be the number 1 overall pick, or at worst, the top 2 or 3 before it's all said and done.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter, and Luke at WNST.net. He will be monitoring all things draft, all things Orioles. We have mini camps coming up here now that we're into June, and of course all of our WNST coverage brought to you by all the sponsors you see around me on the set here at WNST.net. Let's start with Cole Roofing, which is in my coffee cup, but it's actually Royal Farms coffee in the Cole Roofing mug. It's complicated around here. Cole Roofing and Gordian Energy, they sponsor our community and charity commitment that we have around here. You're going to be doing some good stuff this week, talking about some summer festivals and stuff. But Bill Cole has been my therapist around here on Wednesdays for the better part of a year, so we'll see him on Wednesday as well. Royal Farms, meanwhile, real fresh, real fast. I had the tasty fried chicken and the Western fries. I told Haloti Nada, he did not know this. I told him at the press conference last week that you can get gravy at Royal Farms for the Western fries. So that's my new kick. I'm letting everybody know about that. Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast, gas up, rewards card, the app, the whole deal. You know the deal there. Also, Strategic Factory. They actually printed this shirt and hats like this and cups like this. Strategic Factory creates your masterpiece and helps you market your business as well as get you the kind of goods that market your business that say WNST or Baltimore Positive, or in this case, Strategic Factory. They're out in Owings Mills. They work from everywhere. We'll have Keith on the program again soon as well. And, of course, Pizza John's closed on Mondays. They always want me to tell you that, so you want it even more on Tuesdays. That's the way it works for me. 50 years they've been doing it down at Back River Neck Road. 687-7733. It is Pizza John's. I get the big cup around here because I drink a lot of water on the set. What do you want me to say? Luke is here. We are ready for baseball draft, and, it's been hard to watch, Luke, and I want to go through this later on. After the draft, I'll go through all these Rick Mondays and Matt Bushes and David Prices, but I want to go back to 89 and Ben McDonald because that was the one time they had the number 1 pick. I mean, yeah. I've been doing this for 30 years, so I remember every Mark Smith, right? Every Jeffrey Hammonds, all the Matt Wieters and the Nick Markakises of yesteryear. But the Ben McDonald thing was the closest thing there was, and I remember how much heat there was. I mean, you were a kid, but I was down at Ocean City when he made his major league debut and came in out of the bullpen and, the whole deal, and everyone was surrounding him. Now he's a part of the broadcast team, one of the really good dudes, as I know from down in Louisiana State, and wrestling alligators and all that. But he was legitimately in this town in 1989, after what we went through in 1988, a walking superstar. His dad was even a bigger superstar because his dad was his agent, right? Larry, as we for this kid in Adley Rutschman, the modern era. And I said this to my wife. My wife and I were out having a platter at Silver Spring Mining. I looked up on the TV and I saw that all these kids are going to announce their pro days, and these basketball kids, 16 years old, 17 years old, what school they're going to. They're going to have ESPNU is going to cut in and all that. It's a different era for an Adley Rutschman than it was for a Ben McDonald, I think, 30 years later, for what any of these young people. It is a little bit more like football and basketball in that there's an entourage and an attaboy and an agent and a bunch of rules and a bunch of expectations, and teams are not going to turn on your clock once they get all that stuff that happens on the baseball side. But Ben McDonald, 30 years later, I think it's worth at least talking about that he was of that expectation and never could fulfill that, but very few have been Chipper Jones or Ken Griffey, right? Or Harold Baines in this case, who was also a number one who's going to the Hall of Fame unwittingly this summer.
Right, and it really does speak to it being a different era. I mean, we're talking 30 years ago. We just mentioned, not that college baseball has a lot of mainstream popularity, but Adley Rutschman, you just pop his name in YouTube and you're going to see multiple videos. You're going to see home runs. You're going to see him throwing behind the plate. You're going to see all of that. Whereas with Ben McDonald, it really was a folk hero kind of thing. I mean, you just mentioned it. I mean, LSU and wrestling alligators, and he's this really tall guy. He could fit, however many baseballs he could fit in his hand. I remember that being a big thing. I mean, there were just so many different layers.
Well, the other part of that was right after Sid Finch, too, right? So,
right. Yeah, that's definitely, that probably factored in as well.
Well, Andy Bennis the year before, was going to be a god as well. And there was a lot about taking pitchers at that point because of the David Clydes and the Tim Belchers and, these other names of pitchers that went before that really never made it. I mean, David Clyde, Luke, I'm so old that my dad talked to me about David Clyde 1973 and 74 because that's how weird it was when old man Short was rushing him, onto the hill in Arlington when he's 18 years old because he was a local kid to pitch, to sell tickets. They were running a circus, the Texas Rangers were in 1973. We've come a long way from that, that's for sure.
Sure. I mean, it's certainly become more sophisticated, and now so much of what major league teams are using as far as TrackMan data and the high-speed cameras, those different things, these colleges have cameras. They're able to track data. They're able to track data from the high school level. I mean, the Orioles regional workouts to be able to track or to be able to work out players and collect data on draft candidates. So, with Ben McDonald, and let's be very clear about this, Ben McDonald was not a bust in the same light that so many different players. I mean, I think of, Brian Taylor for the Yankees back in the early 90s. Ben McDonald became a major league pitcher. He had a career 3.9 ERA. Wasn't great. Certainly never became Jim Palmer like Orioles fans hoped he would. But what ended up happening? They drafted Mike Mussina the following year, and he ended up being Jim Palmer, so to speak, or coming close to, somewhere close to it at least. In a different era of baseball. But, the hype was real. There was no question about that with Ben McDonald. And
I don't expect it like that here because no one has any expectations for this team. Nobody's watching the games. Nobody's going to the games. There are 100 losses in. We have an incredibly crowded plate of things in our lives that don't make this 1989. So, I mean, Adley Rutschman's going to be a folk hero around us or Witt or whomever. I mean, and for the first 6 months, we thought they were taking Witt, right? Like, this time last year, it was all about Witt. Now it's all about Rutschman, which tells you that the wind blows, This time next year, it might be about Witt, as you pointed out with their number one pick last year, who's exceeded expectations, because that's the way this thing goes. It is a little bit darty, right? It's throw a dart, put a blindfold on, and get in there and coach them up and hope for the best and hope their arm doesn't fall out if you draft a pitcher,
Right. Well, and think about this. I mean, in the NFL draft, we talk all the time about quarterbacks in the first round, and even guys that are considered number one pick worthy and guys that we think or can't miss, they miss all the time. I mean, baseball is even more volatile. Even the teams that know what they are doing to a high degree, like the Houston Astros, look what happened with them. I mean, yeah, they drafted Correa, but they drafted Mark Appel, who didn't work out at all. They drafted Brady Aiken, who ended up not signing because he ended up having a bum arm. And, okay, they did get Alex Bregman the following year, but that certainly wasn't what their plan was. So that's why I think it is important to have a level head about this. And just because all of the experts, just because most people around baseball expect it to be Rutschman, maybe the Orioles do have better information and like Bobby Witt Jr. better. Maybe they, like I said, maybe they do try to get a little more cute and go for someone under slot. That's probably not the way I would go, and I think that's certainly risky.
By the way, we'll sit here all day and talk about catchers and the history of catchers in the draft. I'll save that for afterward, right? Whether they take them or don't. But the pitcher thing, the catcher thing, the high school thing, right? All of that and the history of 50 years of drafting, right? That we could look at all of this, and it's going to make for a fun conversation for the next couple of years. And look, maybe this is a good time to get off the draft for just 1 second and redirect and say they're on the path to having the number one again next year, right? Like literally, when I look down here, I see Astros 12, 13, 14. They picked number one 3 years in a row. The Nationals stunk. They didn't stink once. They stunk twice. That's how they got Strasburg and Harper. The Rays, they didn't stink once. They stunk twice, which is how they got Price and Beckham. So we're now at that point where they might have another number one next year. This is going to be a little bit of a line of who these guys are going to be, but this is really the beginning of this thing, not the be-all, end-all. That's why I don't think anybody's like ordering popcorn and shutting the lights down to watch this draft because, it is the beginning of the ingredients of baking the cake. This is just some of the flour. We haven't put the eggs in. We haven't stirred it up. We haven't even put the oven on yet, literally.
Oh, sure. I mean, there's a long way to go. I mean, you hope that some of the young minor league pitching that is at single A right now, like Grayson Rodriguez, like D.L. Hall, like Blaine Knight. I mean, those are guys that are looking really, really encouraging if you go look at their numbers. And they were already in the system. And maybe those guys will end up being the Orioles equivalent of the Astros already having Dallas Keuchel and already having Jose Altuve and George Springer. I mean, the Astros, it's not as though when Jeff Luhnow and Elias and Sig Mejdal got there that the cupboard was entirely bare. It looked that way at the major league level because of how god-awful they were at the major league level. But you hope that the Orioles already have a few of those ingredients, but they need many, many more. And obviously this first overall pick is going to be huge. Obviously, whatever other players they add in the first somewhere in the range of the first 10 to 15 rounds, you're hoping that you net a handful of other guys that are useful prospects, and maybe a couple of them pop and become really, really good prospects. And that's how you start to build. And then next year, I mean, they're on pace right now. They have the worst record in baseball. They have the worst run differential in baseball. Yeah, some other teams like Kansas City and the Marlins might be heard from before it's all said and done.
We're not going to let you suck worse than us. Don't even think about it.
It really is the race for number one overall.
We're the worst. Trust me. I've seen this.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to argue with you, but Kansas City's pretty darn bad too. And the Marlins, until the last 2 weeks, looked worse than the Orioles. So you never know. But I'll say this. As ugly as it's been, as miserable as it's been to watch, being 18-41 is a much better alternative to this team that very clearly is devoid of legitimate major league talent that's going to have an impact on the future. Are there a couple guys on this current roster that might be around a few years from now? Yeah, sure. They might be the 23rd and 25th player on the roster, but sure, I'll give you that. But where they are right now, as lousy it is to watch it on a nightly basis, is absolutely the better outcome in the big picture than this team that lacks meaningful future pieces playing above its head. And even if they played above its head, what would that mean? Instead of 18-41, all right, they'd be, 25 and 36. That would still stink. That would still not be in contention. That would still be irrelevant.
I don't want to pick fourth next year. I want to pick first.
I mean, you don't want to be picking eighth. I mean, when you're talking about where the Orioles are now, 2 years from now, when hopefully their roster consists of much more intriguing prospects like Ryan Mountcastle and some of these young pitchers I mentioned a few moments ago, then okay, you'll settle for picking 9th or 10th then, if that means that you're suddenly an ascending team and you're getting better and you're better in the second half of the season than you were in the first half of the season. As much as it stinks right now, this really isn't anything that's gone against what their plan was. I mean, that's just the truth. I mean, they could have, hypothetically, they could have spent a bunch of money and gone out and signed some players, or who knows, they could have said, let's re-sign Manny Machado, and then I'll remind everyone that the Orioles stunk with Manny Machado last year until mid-July. So it's more than one player. It's more than one pick. This is a long-term process. There's, as Mike Elias said the day he was hired and introduced in mid-November, there's no fast-forward button on this, but this is a pretty darn important checkpoint, and if you can get a generational talent, or let's just say a guy that maybe isn't going to be a Hall of Famer, but makes 4 or 5 All-Star games, and he's of that ilk, then you'll take it. And you hope that you add a couple other guys that have the potential to be that kind of player over the course of the draft. And then you move on to the international market next month, and you hope to start making some hay there. Not that they're going to be the leading spender in Major League Baseball, but I think it's a good bet that they're not going to be last anymore, and they're not going. They're going to be spending and getting some real talent. And Mike Elias has said that much, and then it'll be going on to next year's draft and next year's international signing period. So you're hoping, with all the losing over these next couple years and what we've already experienced here watching this club, that there will be some light at the end of the tunnel. But boy, it would really be a nice shot in the arm for the organization, for the fan base, if this pick at 1-1 ends up being a really special kind of talent. And if that is Adley Rutschman, like so many are arguing, then great. If it ends up being Bobby Witt Jr., that's someone that many people say would still be the number 1 pick in most typical draft years, then fine. If you go with the high school player and the shortstop that you think might have a little more upside long-term, a little more longevity for a team that's not going to be ready to win over these next couple years, then
I still think if Bobby Witt's name comes off, if there's a crowd, they go, it would be a shock, right? I mean, at this point, given all we've heard about this kid, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this. I don't think Witt being drafted, I think it would certainly be surprising, but I don't think it'd be a major shock. I think
if it's any other name, if it's a third
anyone
name,
else,
right?
Like let's say the kid from California, the first baseman Andrew Vaughn, who's considered a hell of a hitter, but he's a first baseman. If you're talking about wanting to draft players, where do you want to draft? You want to draft up the middle. You want athletes. You want guys that have some flexibility. In the case of Adley Rutschman, he's a catcher.
By the way, the
now.
last first baseman drafted was Adrián González in 2000. Not a bad pick, by the way.
Yeah, oh, sure. But when you're talking about players that are on the corner, if they can't hack it, where do they go?
By the way,
right?
Ron Bloomberg's the only other first baseman ever picked first, 1967.
Right, but the point, and the reason why is you want to have some flexibility. If a guy's drafted as a center fielder or a shortstop, and they're not quite good enough to play center field or shortstop, well, you move them to another infield
Or if you're
position.
P.J. Suroff, you draft him as a catcher, move him to shortstop if you want.
Yeah. Well, and that's where, as much as people, and we haven't gotten into this too much, because if they do indeed draft Rutschman, we'll be talking about this plenty.
Sure.
Probably for the next couple of years, frankly. But that's where people that are a little leery and saying, okay, is this going to be another Matt Wieters? Which, again, Matt Wieters was not anything close to being a bust. It's just that he didn't become Johnny Bench. He didn't become Maurer with power, but he was still an all-star player for a few years, and he was still really important to their success that they had from 12 through 16. So I want to keep reminding everyone
when you
of that.
look through all these number ones, you don't see Willie Mays and Hank Aaron as much as you see Sean Dunston and Mike Moore. And, and even B.J. Suroff was a really nice player, and Andy Bennis, and Phil Nevin, who's going on to – these are all nice players, but they're all just guys. I mean, they were nice 280 ball players who lasted 10 years, which is, you better at least get that. You better at least get Matt Wieters out of this. You better get somebody that plays 5 years and hits 280 and, starts 150 games and you get the first contract out of him. You better get that, right?
Oh, no question about that. And I think that's where people that are, and specifically people who've monitored the Orioles and rooted for the Orioles, that's where I think there is a little more trepidation with Rutschman because of the sheer longevity of a catcher compared to a shortstop. I mean, the average career length as far as playing that specific position is much shorter at catcher. And if you're talking about a team that's on a long-term rebuild here, is there some argument to be made that Witt might be the better pick? I'll hear that to a degree, but I think, again, you have to take the absolute best talent here. And most people seem to think that's Adley Rutschman. And as far as the Wieters comparison, most of the talent evaluators out there, the pundits, the Jim Callises, the Keith Laws, the consensus is Rutschman has a better bat than Wieters had. So even if you get to a point where Rutschman catches for 6 years, say you re-sign him hypothetically because he's been that good of a player, then there is considered to be a path for him to go the route of a Joe Mauer and become a first baseman and still be a guy that's going to be a really important player for you from an offensive standpoint. So, the problem with Wieters was the bat ended up not being nearly as good as a lot of people thought it would be. And the issue was, okay, his bat's still plus for a catcher, but you shift him to first base, and suddenly you're talking about a below-average offensive first baseman. So that was always the rub with Wieters, especially as time went on. With Rutschman, people seem to think that he's a bat and a markedly better bat than what Wieters was. So even if he only catches for 6-7 years in the major leagues and then transitions to first base, that won't necessarily be a bad path. But let's also remember, let's look at the Cardinals, where Mike Elias was first hired. That was his first major league team that he worked for. Look at what impact Yadier Molina has had for that organization, the longevity that he's had. And I know that's the exception, but if you are talking about the number 1 overall pick, that's when you have the chance to draft the exception to the rule. That's when you have the chance to draft a special generational kind of talent. And I have no idea if Adley Rutschman's going to be that guy, but if Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal and the Orioles brass, if they believe that Adley Rutschman can be that kind of guy, then I have no problem with them drafting a catcher, even if you look at it on paper and you're a little leery, you're a little uneasy about what his timeline is going to be compared to what this organization's projected timeline is going to be for them to be relevant and in contention again.
Beaver Fever, we got it around here. It is Adley Rutschman. I just like saying his name, Sherwood High School. We'll see if this happens. Luke Jones can be found, Luke at WNST.net, and Baltimore Luke, of course, we're always after. We got so many great new sponsors here. We signed 9 new sponsors this month. I'm going to be giving love to all of them. We are doing Baltimore Positive at Fadley's in Lexington Market. That means crab cakes for me, crab cakes for you, soft shells. We're going to do it all in the big French fries, the proper way. We'll be at Lexington Market this summer at Baltimore Positive. We want to give them some love. All of our Baltimore Positive stuff. Freeman Rabowski, president of UMBC. You can find that in the BuyAToyota.com audio vault, as well as at Baltimore Positive this week. Big shout out to our friends at State Fair who hosted us last week. My wife said, "Did you get the Chesapeake Benedict?" I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "You're addicted." I'm like, not officially addicted because they still have waffles and chicken there, and they still have other things that I will order. That being said, I am probably addicted to the chicken Benedict. I think Moeller likes that meat lovers Benedict. I'm going to try that this week. 748 Frederick Road, outside seating. It's lovely. It's State Fair. Great food. Make sure you go see them. My man Sidney fixed my wife's ring over Charles Newsonoff and Sons in Parkville. Make sure you go see him. You know, he's been there forever. He's been with us forever. Charles Newsonoff and Sons. And he did the band special for 50% off last week. If you ask him this week, he might still do it for you. But I know he's got a new offer this week, so I'll be telling you about that. Charles Newsonoff and Sons in Parkville. Also, Full Circle. We trust Dave and our friends at Full Circle. You know, we did work on the Nasty van, the Get Nasty van, the tires and stuff. That's how long we've known Dave. It feels like that van's been gone like 15 years. I've known Dave a long time. Tires, and more tires. 38 brands in stock. They also have the 1995 oil change there. And if your AC's fritzy, this would be a good time to get that fixed. Make sure you check them out. Up to 2 pounds, $69.95. That's the R134. 2133 North Fountain Green Road in Bel Air. Just call them. They'll tell you where they are. 410-676-CARS. 410-676-CARS. Dave at Full Circle. I'm going to be telling you more about site support and Icy Delights. Johnny D is back with us with the shrimp salad and the hideaway. We'll be telling you about that, as well as our friends at Adams Extreme Motorsports, where we're going to be doing some Raven shows up there like we've done for many, many years. And I had Steve on last week as well. So lots of great sponsors. Great summer ahead. MLB draft, NBA finals, Stanley Cup finals. We're doing it all. I'll be watching some more sports over at Silver Spring Mining up in Hunt Valley as well with Gary Rissling as well. It's busy month around here. I'm Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 at WNST Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports.